I caught a girl FaceTiming my boyfriend at spin class. His mom showed up and slapped him. I was halfway through spin class when I saw the blonde in front of me FaceTiming my boyfriend of 4 years. "Can't wait to see you tonight, beautiful," Blake said on her screen. "Can't believe it's been 3 months already," she responded. I almost threw up. The instructor stopped the music when she saw me crying. "That's my boyfriend." I pointed at the screen. The entire studio went silent. 25 women staring. The blonde Isabella hung up and turned around. "Girl, I swear I didn't know." Every woman climbed off their bikes. Someone handed me water. Someone else had tissues. They found his Instagram in seconds. His latest post was us at the beach, captioned, "Love of my life." "Call his sister. Speaker." "Now," someone said. I called Ellie with shaking hands. "Hey, babe. How's spin?" Blake's FaceTiming another girl. They've been dating 3 months. Silence. Then, "I'm getting mom. Don't move." Isabella and I held hands, both victims. The whole class surrounded us with support. 15 minutes later, Ellie burst in with her mom and aunt. Mrs. Leake's face went through every emotion seeing Isabella and me together. "Call your brother." NOW. Blake walked in 20 minutes later in ratty sweats. Saw the wall of angry women. His mom, his sister. Me crying. Isabella looking betrayed. "Mom, I can explain." Slap. Mrs. Leake's hand connected so hard everyone gasped. 4 years! I've been planning your wedding." The entire class erupted. Phones recording. She grabbed his ear like he was 5 and dragged him out. "You're moving back to your anime poster room." "Mom, I'm 25. 25 and stupid." Ellie followed, filming everything. His aunt stayed, hugged us both. Weak genes from his father's side. Isabella and I exchanged numbers, finished class together. I went home feeling free. At 2 a.m., my phone exploded. Blake's texts, voicemails, all unhinged. "You ruined my life!" "Mom took my car." Screaming, crying, threatening to destroy me. I screenshotted everything. Blake worked at a fancy finance firm, always bragging about his powerful boss. Found her on LinkedIn. Sent everything. Subject line, "Your new analyst, Blake Leak." Monday morning, Isabella texted, "Check Instagram." Ellie had posted the video. Her mom dragging Blake out by his ear had 3 million views. Comments were brutal. Someone found he'd lied about his college GPA. Another girl said she'd matched with him on Bumble last month. His boss responded, "Mr. Leak's employment has been terminated effective immediately." Blake's mom texted, "Dinner Sunday. Your family, bring Isabella." Isabella and I became best friends. Spin class every Saturday. The instructor plays Before He Cheats when we walk in. Blake's new Tinder surfaced in our group chat. Bio, 25, entrepreneur, looking for something real. Living in mom's basement isn't entrepreneurship, Blake. His mom comments on all my posts. "Gorgeous. Should have been my daughter-in-law." Blake blocked her. She made new accounts to keep commenting. But yesterday, everything changed. Isabella called me crying. "I need to tell you something." "What's wrong?" "About Blake." I lied. My blood went cold. "What?" "We weren't dating 3 months. It was 6 months." "What?" "He told me about you from the beginning. Said you were crazy, stalking him, that he was trying to leave but you threatened suicide." I couldn't breathe. "I believed him until I saw you in class. You weren't crazy. You were in love. Why are you telling me now?" "Because there's more. I wasn't the only one." "What do you mean?" "He has a whole system. Multiple girls, all thinking they're exclusive. All told the others are crazy exes." "How many?" "At least 4 current ones. Maybe more." "We need to tell them that's not all. Remember his boss who fired him?" "Yeah?" "He's been messaging her, threatening her, says she ruined his life over nothing. He sent her photos." "What photos?" "Of her. Taken outside her apartment, her gym, her parking garage." My hands shook. "He's stalking her?" "She went to the police, but they said without direct threats. They can't do anything." "This is insane." "There's one more thing. He texted me last night, said he knows where you live, where you work, your schedule." I looked out my window. A familiar car parked across the street. "Isabella, I think he's outside my apartment right now." "Call the police. I'm coming over." The car door opened. Blake stepped out, something in his hand. "He's coming to my door." The line went dead. My doorbell rang, then pounding. "I know you're in there. You and Isabella ruined everything." More pounding, the door handle rattling. "Open up or I'm coming in anyway. We need to talk about what happens next." The handle turned. I'd forgotten to lock the deadbolt. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table, my fingers shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Blake's fist hit the door again. Harder this time, and I could hear the wood making this weird creaking sound. I swiped to unlock my screen and pulled up 911, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The door handle kept turning, rattling against the lock that wasn't locked all the way. A door opened down the hall, and I heard Raphael's voice cut through the noise. He lived in 4B, always said hi when we passed each other in the hallway. His voice was loud and clear when he yelled that he was calling the cops right now. Blake stopped pounding for just a second, and I used that moment to run. My legs felt like jelly, but I made it to my bedroom and started pushing my dresser toward the door. The thing was heavy and it scraped against the floor, making this awful sound, but I kept pushing until it blocked the doorway. The 911 lady answered and asked what my emergency was, and I could barely get the words out. My ex-boyfriend was trying to break into my apartment. He was in the hallway right now, trying to force my door open. She asked if I was safe, and I told her I was in my bedroom with the dresser against the door, but he was still out there. She told me police were on the way and to stay on the line with her. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might pass out. I could hear Blake yelling through the door about how I ruined his life, how this was all my fault, how Isabella and I were going to pay for what we did. The 911 lady kept asking me questions, and I answered them, but my voice sounded weird and far away. Was he armed? I didn't know. Had he threatened me before? Yes. The texts from last night. Was anyone else in the apartment? No, just me. She kept talking to me in this calm voice while I sat on my bedroom floor with my back against the dresser, listening to Blake lose his mind in my hallway. The sirens came fast, way faster than I expected. 4 minutes according to the 911 lady who stayed on the phone with me the whole time. I heard new voices in the hallway, deep and official sounding, telling Blake to step away from the door. Blake's voice changed completely. He went from screaming and threatening to this smooth, charming tone like flipping a switch. He told the officers this was just a big misunderstanding with his girlfriend. We'd had a fight and he just wanted to talk to me. His voice sounded so normal and reasonable that for a second I wondered if I was crazy. But then I remembered the texts, the threats, Isabella's warnings about him stalking his boss. The officers asked him to step back, and one of them knocked on my door. He said he was Officer Martinez and asked if I was okay in there. I told him through the door that I was scared, that Blake had been threatening me, that I had screenshots of everything. Raphael's voice joined in, telling them he'd seen Blake's car parked outside for 3 nights in a row, always late at night, just sitting there watching the building. The officer asked if I could come out and give a statement, but I couldn't move. I told him I was too scared, that I needed to know Blake was in handcuffs first. I heard them talking to Blake, asking him why he was trying to force entry into someone's apartment. Blake kept insisting we just needed to talk, that I was being dramatic, that this was all blown out of proportion. But his voice had this edge to it now, this barely controlled anger that the officers must have heard too. One of them asked him to put his hands behind his back, and Blake's voice got louder, asking why they were treating him like a criminal when he hadn't done anything wrong. I heard a scuffle, and Raphael saying something about a baseball bat and the officers telling everyone to stay calm. Finally, Officer Martinez knocked again and told me Blake was in custody and it was safe to come out. I pushed the dresser away from the door with legs that barely worked and opened it to see Blake in handcuffs between 2 officers. His eyes locked on mine and his face twisted into something ugly. The charming mask was completely gone now, and I saw the real rage underneath. A detective showed up about 30 minutes later while the officers were still taking statements. She was Asian, maybe mid-30s, wearing a dark blazer and looking tired like she'd been up for way too long. She introduced herself as Detective Elena Tanaka, and when she heard Blake's name, her whole expression changed. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through something, then looked at Blake and then at me. She told the officers to hold on a second and asked me if I knew someone named Cassie Rollins. My stomach dropped. That was Blake's old boss, the one Isabella told me he was stalking. I nodded and Detective Tanaka's jaw got tight. She asked if we could talk privately and led me back into my apartment while the officers kept Blake in the hallway. We sat at my kitchen table and she pulled out a notebook. She asked me to tell her everything, starting from the beginning. I showed her the text from last night where Blake threatened to destroy me. I showed her the screenshots of his unhinged voicemails. I told her about Isabella calling me earlier, about finding out Blake had been dating multiple women, about how he'd been sending threatening messages to Cassie and taking photos of her outside her apartment. Detective Tanaka's expression got darker with every detail I shared. She took photos of my phone screen with the threatening texts. She asked about the timeline, about when Blake and I broke up, about the viral video that exposed him. I walked her through everything from spin class to now. When I showed her the 2 a.m. texts where Blake said he was going to make me pay, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She excused herself and went back into the hallway. I could hear her talking to the other officers in a low, serious voice. She came back a few minutes later and told me they were going to hold Blake for psychiatric evaluation. It would buy us some time, maybe 72 hours. But she was frustrated because even with everything I'd shown her, the system had limits. She explained that stalking cases were hard to prosecute until something actually happened, and tonight Blake had finally crossed that line by trying to force entry. But she needed to build a stronger case fast because once the 72 hours were up, Blake could be released. Isabella burst through my apartment door while Detective Tanaka was still there. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from crying. She had 2 overnight bags with her, one for each of us, and she just dropped them and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should have warned me sooner, that she never thought Blake would actually try to break in. Detective Tanaka introduced herself and asked Isabella to sit down. Isabella told her everything she knew about Blake's system. She had names and phone numbers for 2 other women she'd found who were dating Blake at the same time as us. She showed Detective Tanaka screenshots of conversations where Blake had told each woman the same lies about the others being crazy exes. She explained how Blake had been dating her for 6 months while telling her I was a stalker who threatened suicide. Detective Tanaka took notes on everything, her pen moving fast across the page. When Isabella finished, the detective sat back and rubbed her face. She looked exhausted and angry. She told us the truth, that even with tonight's incident, Blake would probably be released within 72 hours unless they could build a much stronger case really quickly. She needed more evidence, more victims willing to come forward, more documentation of his stalking behavior. The frustration in her voice was clear. She knew Blake was dangerous, but the legal system moved slowly and required proof of everything. She gave us both her card and told us to call her immediately if we remembered anything else or if anyone else contacted us about Blake. She also told us to stay somewhere else tonight, somewhere Blake didn't know about. Isabella said we could stay at her place, and Detective Tanaka nodded. She walked us out past where Blake had been standing, but he was gone now, already taken to the station. Raphael was still in the hallway talking to one of the officers. Raphael saw us and came over. He looked worried and asked if we were okay. I thanked him for calling 911 and for standing guard with his baseball bat. But no, he waved it off like it was nothing, but I could see he'd been scared too. Detective Tanaka asked him if he could give a statement, and Raphael nodded. He pulled out his phone and started showing her photos. He'd taken pictures of Blake's car parked across the street for 3 nights in a row. The photos were time-stamped, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., just sitting there with Blake inside. Raphael explained that the second night he'd noticed the same car in the same spot. He took a photo of the license plate because something felt wrong about a guy just sitting there watching the building for hours. He showed Detective Tanaka at least a dozen photos spanning 3 different nights. Her eyes lit up when she saw them. This was exactly the kind of evidence she needed to prove Blake had been stalking me before tonight's attempted break-in. She asked Raphael if he'd be willing to testify if it came to that, and he said absolutely. He described seeing Blake in the car, watching the building, sometimes looking at his phone, sometimes just staring at the windows. Raphael said he'd almost called the cops on the second night, but wasn't sure if sitting in a parked car was actually illegal. Now he wished he had. Detective Tanaka assured him his documentation was crucial evidence and asked him to email her all the photos with the timestamps intact. She explained that stalking cases required proving a pattern of behavior over time, and Raphael's photos showed Blake had been surveilling my apartment for days before the attempted entry. This turned it from a one-time incident into something much more serious. Raphael promised to send everything over tonight and gave Detective Tanaka his contact information. She thanked him and told him he might have just saved someone's life with those photos. Detective Tanaka got a call while we were standing in the hallway and stepped away to answer it. When she came back, her expression was different, more focused. She told us she'd just gotten approval for a warrant to search Blake's phone. She was heading back to the station now to process it. She told Isabella and me to go straight to Isabella's apartment and not to come back here until she gave us the all clear. She'd call us tomorrow with an update. Isabella grabbed our bags and we headed down to her car. The drive to her place was quiet, except for my hands shaking in my lap. Isabella reached over and squeezed my hand without saying anything. When we got to her apartment, it was almost midnight. We sat on her couch with all the lights on because neither of us wanted to be in the dark. Isabella made tea that neither of us drank, and we just sat there trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. My phone buzzed and I jumped so hard I almost dropped it. It was Detective Tanaka. She'd gotten into Blake's phone and found exactly what she was looking for. Photos of Cassie outside her apartment building, outside her gym, in the parking garage at her work. But it wasn't just Cassie. There were photos of me too. Pictures of me leaving my apartment, getting into my car, walking into the grocery store. Dates and times noted in the file names. And there were photos of Isabella and 2 other women I didn't recognize. Blake had organized everything into folders on his phone. Each woman had her own folder with photos tracking her movements, screenshots of her social media, notes about her schedule and regular locations. Detective Tanaka said the scope of his stalking operation shocked even her, and she'd been doing this job for 12 years. She was contacting the district attorney right now about filing formal charges. Blake's carefully kept records would be the evidence that buried him. She told us to try to get some sleep, and she'd call with more information in the morning. Isabella and I stayed up all night anyway. We couldn't sleep even though we were both exhausted. We went through everything we knew about Blake, trying to make sense of how we'd missed the signs. Isabella showed me screenshots of conversations with a woman named Adriana Hansen, who had contacted her after seeing the viral video. Adriana said she'd dated Blake for 8 months and had no idea about me or Isabella or anyone else. She thought they were exclusive the whole time. Isabella had been messaging back and forth with her, comparing notes about Blake's lies. We pulled up a calendar on Isabella's laptop and started building a timeline. Based on what we knew from me, Isabella, and Adriana, plus the 2 other women Detective Tanaka mentioned, Blake had been managing at least 5 relationships at the same time. 5 women, who all thought they were his only girlfriend. The timeline showed overlapping date nights, identical text messages sent to multiple women, the same excuses about working late or visiting his sick grandmother. He'd told each of us slightly different stories about his life to keep us separated. He told me his mom was overbearing and he needed space from family dinners. He told Isabella his family was distant and cold. He told Adriana his parents were dead. All lies designed to explain why we never met each other or saw him with other people. We worked on the timeline until the sun came up, filling in gaps and finding patterns. Blake had a system. He scheduled different women on different nights. He used separate social media accounts to keep us apart. He told elaborate lies about his schedule to explain his absences. The organization of it all was creepy and calculated. This wasn't a guy who made mistakes or got confused. This was someone who deliberately built a system to deceive multiple women simultaneously. My phone rang at 8 a.m. and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Mrs. Leek. Her voice was thick with crying, and she could barely get words out at first. Detective Tanaka had called her an hour ago about Blake's arrest and the evidence they'd found on his phone. Mrs. Leek was devastated. She kept saying she didn't raise him to be like this, that she didn't understand where it all went wrong. She told me she'd gone through Blake's childhood bedroom after the detective called, looking for answers. What she found made her sick. Blake had journals from high school, detailed accounts of dating multiple girls at once and lying to all of them. He wrote about it like it was a game, like he was proud of how well he could manipulate people. The pattern started when he was 16 and never stopped. Mrs. Leek's voice broke when she told me about reading page after page of her son, describing how he played different girls against each other, how he enjoyed the control, how easy it was to make them believe whatever he wanted. She said maybe she should have seen the signs back then, but she'd thought it was just normal teenage boy stuff, bragging in a diary. She never imagined it would turn into this. She never thought her son would become someone who stalked women and tried to break into their homes. She apologized to me over and over, saying she was so sorry, that she should have raised him better. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part of me was angry that she hadn't seen it sooner, hadn't stopped it before Blake hurt so many people. She told me she was going to testify for the prosecution if they asked her to. She said Blake needed to face real consequences this time, not excuses or family protection. She said she loved her son, but she loved the truth more, and the truth was that Blake was dangerous. Ellie posted an update to the viral video around noon. Isabella's phone started blowing up first, then mine. Ellie had edited together clips from the original spin class confrontation with new text explaining that Blake had been arrested for stalking and attempted break-in. She asked any other women who'd dated Blake to please contact the police with information. She included Detective Tanaka's direct line and the case number. The update got shared even faster than the original video. Within an hour, it had 50,000 views. Within 3 hours, it was at 500,000. The comment section filled up with women sharing their own stories about Blake. Someone from his college said he'd dated her roommate and another girl in their dorm at the same time. Someone else said she'd matched with him on 3 different dating apps using 3 different names. Detective Tanaka called me at 2 p.m. and said her phone hadn't stopped ringing since Ellie's post went live. She'd taken statements from 3 more women so far, including one who said Blake had shown up at her workplace repeatedly after she broke up with him 2 years ago. The woman had moved to a different city to get away from him, but never filed a police report because she didn't think anyone would believe her. Detective Tanaka's voice was grim when she explained that Blake's pattern of escalating when women tried to leave him was becoming clear and scary. Each woman who tried to end things with him faced increasing levels of harassment and stalking. The woman from college had him show up at her classes. The woman from 2 years ago had him appear at her job, her gym, her favorite coffee shop. And now me, with him trying to force his way into my apartment. The detective said the district attorney was building a case that would hopefully put Blake away for a long time, but she needed me to be prepared for a difficult legal process ahead. Cassie Rollins called me directly that afternoon. I didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. Her voice was professional but strained when she introduced herself. She'd seen Ellie's update and wanted to compare notes about Blake's behavior. She told me about working with Blake at the finance firm, how he'd seemed professional and charming at first. Everyone liked him. He was good at his job, or at least good at appearing to be good at his job. But then she'd started noticing irregularities in his client reports, numbers that didn't add up, documentation that seemed falsified. She'd confronted him privately first, giving him a chance to explain. His entire demeanor changed in that moment. The charm disappeared and she saw cold anger underneath. He told her she was wrong, that she was targeting him, that she'd regret making accusations she couldn't prove. But Cassie had proof. She'd documented everything before confronting him. When she showed him the evidence, he'd gotten quiet and scary. He didn't yell or argue. He just looked at her with this flat expression and said, okay. She fired him that day following proper procedures with HR present. And then the stalking started. Photos of her outside her apartment. Messages from fake accounts. Him showing up places she regularly went. She'd gone to the police, but they said without direct threats they couldn't do much. Now with Blake's arrest and the evidence on his phone, she finally felt like someone was taking her seriously. She told me she understood now that Blake's rage wasn't about love or loss or even the job. It was about control. When she held him accountable for his actions, she took away his control, and that's what he couldn't handle. Every woman who tried to set boundaries with Blake faced his escalating anger, because we were challenging his belief that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Detective Tanaka called me 3 days after Blake's arrest and asked me to come to the police station for a meeting. She said other women had come forward after seeing the viral video, and she wanted us all to meet together in a safe space. I walked into a conference room and saw 6 other women sitting around a long table, all of us looking nervous and uncertain. Isabella was already there, and so was Cassie. The other 4 women introduced themselves as Adriana, Morgan, Jenna, and Sophie. Detective Tanaka explained that Blake had been dating all of us at the same time, telling each of us different stories about the others. Adriana said Blake told her I was his cousin, who had mental health problems and needed his support. Morgan said he claimed Isabella was his therapist, who he had to see regularly for work stress. Jenna said Blake told her Cassie was a bitter former co-worker who got fired and blamed him. Each story was carefully designed to explain away our existence while making Blake look like the hero, dealing with difficult people in his life. We sat there staring at each other, realizing the massive scale of his manipulation. He didn't just lie about having girlfriends. He created entire fake narratives about who we were and why we existed in his life. Detective Tanaka showed us printouts from Blake's phone, where he had organized us into folders with detailed notes about our schedules, our friends, our jobs, even our menstrual cycles, so he could plan which of us to see when. The level of planning was scary, and showed this wasn't some guy who accidentally got in over his head with relationships. This was someone who deliberately built a system to control multiple women. So Adriana started crying and said she'd been with Blake for 8 months and had no idea about any of us. Sophie said she'd only been dating him for 6 weeks, but already felt like something was off because he was never available on weekends. Morgan revealed she'd gotten pregnant 2 months ago, and Blake had pressured her to get an abortion, saying he wasn't ready to be a father, and now she understood he couldn't be a father because he was too busy managing his other relationships. The room went quiet after that revelation. Detective Tanaka let us talk and share our experiences for over an hour, and patterns emerged that were chilling. Blake always positioned himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. He always had an excuse for why he couldn't see us on certain days, or why he needed to keep our relationship quiet from certain people. He always made us feel special and chosen, while simultaneously making us feel like we needed to prove ourselves worthy of him. Cassie spoke up and said this same pattern showed up at work, where Blake made himself look like the hardest working analyst while actually falsifying reports and taking credit for other people's work. When she caught him, he immediately flipped the script and tried to make her look like the problem. We all recognized that manipulation tactic from our own experiences with him. The district attorney came in after our meeting and explained she was filing multiple charges against Blake, including stalking, harassment, attempted breaking and entering, and violation of privacy laws for his surveillance activities. She said the evidence from his phone showing the organized tracking of all of us made the case much stronger than typical stalking cases, where it's just one person's word against another. Blake's parents had hired an expensive defense attorney, who was already trying to argue that Blake had mental health issues and shouldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. The DA said this was a common defense strategy in cases like this, trying to get sympathy by painting the defendant as sick rather than criminal. My phone rang while we were still at the station, and I saw it was Mrs. Elite calling. I stepped out into the hallway to answer, and she was crying, but also angry. She told me Blake's father wanted to help pay for his defense attorney, but she had refused and they'd gotten into a huge fight about it. She said Blake needed to face real consequences for what he'd done, not get bailed out again by his parents making excuses for his behavior. She asked me how the meeting at the police station went, and I told her about meeting all the other women and realizing how many of us there were. Mrs. Leek went quiet for a moment, and then said she felt sick knowing her son had hurt so many people and she hadn't seen the signs. I told her it wasn't her fault because Blake was really good at hiding who he really was, but she said a mother should know when something is wrong with her child. She told me she'd been going through old family photos and videos trying to figure out when Blake became this person, looking for clues she missed. I didn't know what to say to make her feel better because I was still trying to process everything myself. She said she wanted to help however she could, whether that meant testifying against Blake or supporting all of us through the legal process. I thanked her and told her just knowing she believed us and wasn't making excuses for Blake meant everything. The judge granted emergency restraining orders for me, Isabella, Cassie, and Adriana the next day, based on the evidence of Blake's stalking and threatening behavior. Detective Tanaka called each of us to explain what the restraining orders meant and what would happen next. Blake was released on bail with an ankle monitor and strict orders not to contact any of us or come within 500 feet of our homes, workplaces, or any place he knew we regularly went. Detective Tanaka's voice was serious when she warned us that restraining orders are just pieces of paper and determined stalkers often violate them. She said we each needed to develop safety plans and she'd help us figure out what that looked like for our specific situations. She came to my apartment that afternoon and walked through my building with me, pointing out security weaknesses and suggesting changes. She noticed my door only had a regular lock and the deadbolt I'd forgotten to lock the night Blake tried to break in. She wrote down the name of a locksmith who did security installations and said I should call them today. She helped me map out my regular routines and identify which ones I needed to change immediately. I'd been going to the same coffee shop every morning before work, the same grocery store every Wednesday evening, the same walking route with my usual path through the neighborhood. Detective Tanaka explained that Blake had been tracking these patterns, and I needed to break them to make it harder for him to predict where I'd be. She helped me set up a check-in system with Isabella and Raphael, where I'd text them at certain times each day so they'd know I was okay. If they didn't hear from me at the scheduled times, they had permission to call the police and do a wellness check. She also gave me a direct number to call her cell phone if I saw Blake or felt unsafe, saying not to wait and go through regular channels if I needed help fast. The whole conversation made me realize how serious this situation was and how much danger I might still be in even with Blake on an ankle monitor. I called the locksmith Detective Tanaka recommended, and they came out that same evening to install new locks on my apartment. The locksmith looked at my current setup and shook his head, saying a regular deadbolt wasn't going to stop someone determined to get in. He installed commercial-grade deadbolts on both my front door and the door from my apartment to the shared hallway, the kind that needed keys on both sides so no one could break a window and reach through to unlock it from inside. He added a security bar that wedged under my door handle and braced against the floor, making it almost impossible to force the door open even if someone got through the locks. He put new locks on all my windows that required a key to open, replacing the cheap latches that came with the apartment. The whole installation took 3 hours and cost me $800 I hadn't planned to spend. Raphael came over while the locksmith was working and offered to help me set up a camera doorbell system he'd bought online. He showed me how it worked, with a camera that would record anyone who came near my door and send alerts to my phone whenever there was motion in the hallway. He helped me download the app and test it to make sure I'd get notifications immediately if someone approached. The financial cost of all this security hurt because I was already dealing with reduced hours at work after taking time off for the Blake situation. But Detective Tanaka's warnings kept echoing in my head about the danger period right after arrest. The psychological cost of feeling unsafe in my own home was worse than the money. I needed to be able to sleep at night without jumping at every sound in the hallway. Raphael's wife brought over dinner while we were setting up the camera system and sat with me while I ate, asking how I was holding up. I admitted I was scared and exhausted and angry that I had to spend money and time and energy protecting myself from someone who'd already taken 4 years of my life. She hugged me and said she and Raphael would be right next door if I needed anything, day or night, and I shouldn't hesitate to knock on their door or call them. Saturday morning came and Isabella texted asking if I still wanted to go to spin class or if it felt too weird after everything that happened there. I thought about staying home but realized I didn't want Blake to take away something I enjoyed in a community that had supported me. Isabella picked me up and we walked into the studio together, both of us nervous about how people would react. The entire class started clapping when we came through the door. Women got up from their bikes to hug us and ask how we were doing and what they could do to help. The instructor came over and said she'd been following the news about Blake's arrest and wanted us to know the whole studio supported us. She asked if we were okay with her making an announcement to the class, and we said yes. She explained to everyone what had happened with Blake's stalking and arrest, keeping the details appropriate but making it clear this was serious. She said the studio wanted to organize a self-defense workshop for anyone interested in learning practical safety skills. 20 women immediately raised their hands to sign up. Someone suggested starting a group chat so we could all check in on each other and share safety tips. Another woman who worked in tech offered to help anyone who wanted to review their digital security and privacy settings. The solidarity that started with my discovery of Blake's FaceTime had turned into something bigger than just my situation. These women were taking the fear and anger from what happened and channeling it into practical support for each other. We did the full spin class and the instructor played Before He Cheats when Isabella and I walked in, which made everyone laugh and cheer. For 50 minutes, I focused on the music and the movement and felt almost normal. After class, several women stayed to talk and share their own experiences with manipulative or dangerous ex-partners. I realized how common this was, and how many women had similar stories, but never talked about them because they felt ashamed or thought no one would believe them. A message request popped up on my Instagram that afternoon from someone named Malik Townsend. He said his sister Raina had shown him the viral video of Blake getting dragged out of spin class and told him about her own experience dating Blake 2 years ago. Malik wrote that Blake's harassment of Raina after their breakup got so bad, she had to change jobs and move to a different city to get away from him. She never filed a police report because she didn't think the police would take it seriously or be able to do anything. Malik said he'd wanted to confront Blake at the time, but Raina begged him not to because she was afraid it would make things worse. Now that Blake was finally facing charges, Malik wanted to know if there was anything he could do to help the case. He said his protective anger on behalf of his sister had never gone away, and he'd be willing to testify about Blake's pattern of behavior if it would help. I screenshot his message and sent it to Detective Tanaka, who called me back within an hour. She said Raina's case was really important because it established Blake's long-term pattern of escalating when women tried to leave him. She asked if I could connect her with Malik so she could get Raina's contact information and see if Raina would be willing to give a statement. I sent Malik Detective Tanaka's information, and he responded immediately saying he'd call her right away. 2 hours later, Detective Tanaka texted me that she'd spoken to both Malik and Raina had agreed to provide a detailed statement about Blake's harassment 2 years ago. Detective Tanaka said this was exactly the kind of evidence that would show the judge and jury that Blake's behavior toward me wasn't a one-time breakdown, but a consistent pattern spanning years. Detective Tanaka connected me with a victim advocate named Susie who specialized in stalking cases. Susie called me and we set up a meeting at a coffee shop near my new apartment. She brought a folder full of information about stalking statistics and safety planning. She explained that Blake's behavior fit the profile of what experts call intimate partner stalkers, who are statistically the most dangerous type of stalker. Susie said that unlike stranger stalkers or acquaintance stalkers, intimate partner stalkers already know everything about their victims, including their routines, their friends, their families, their fears. They use that inside knowledge to maintain control and punish their victims for trying to leave. She showed me research about how intimate partner stalkers are more likely to escalate to physical violence than other types of stalkers. The advocate explained that Blake's progression from cheating to surveillance to attempted break-in followed a predictable pattern that researchers had documented in thousands of cases. She said the most dangerous period is often right after arrest, when the stalker feels they have nothing left to lose and their sense of control has been completely shattered. This information scared me, but also helped me understand why Detective Tanaka and everyone else were taking this so seriously. Susie helped me review my safety plan and suggested additional precautions I hadn't thought of. She recommended varying my route to work every day instead of just changing which coffee shop I went to. She suggested telling my boss about the situation, so workplace security could be alert for Blake trying to show up there. She gave me information about a support group for stalking survivors that met twice a month and encouraged me to attend at least once to connect with people who understood what I was going through. Susie also warned me that the legal process would be long and frustrating, with court dates that got rescheduled and defense attorneys who would try to make me feel like I was overreacting or lying. She said having a support system and taking care of my mental health would be just as important as the physical security measures. Before she left, Susie gave me her direct phone number and said I could call anytime if I needed to talk or had questions about the legal process. Blake's ankle monitor sent an alert to police 3 days after his release. Detective Tanaka called me immediately to tell me Blake had approached within 500 feet of my apartment building, violating his restraining order. Police were on their way to arrest him again. She said I should stay inside with my doors locked until she confirmed Blake was in custody. I watched through my window and saw police cars pull up about 20 minutes later. They must have picked Blake up somewhere nearby because they didn't come to my building. Detective Tanaka called back an hour later to confirm Blake was arrested and being taken back to jail. She said this time the judge would likely revoke his bail entirely because he'd proven he couldn't follow court orders even with an ankle monitor. She sounded almost satisfied when she told me this violation actually strengthened the prosecution's case by demonstrating Blake's inability to control his behavior, even with court-ordered restrictions. The district attorney could now argue that Blake posed a clear ongoing threat and couldn't be trusted to stay away from his victims even under supervision. Detective Tanaka said the judge scheduled an emergency bail hearing for the next morning and she'd let me know the outcome. I felt relief that Blake was back in jail, but also fear about what he'd been planning to do when he came near my building. Had he been coming to try to get into my apartment again? Was he watching to see my patterns? Detective Tanaka said the ankle monitor data showed he'd been in the area for about 15 minutes before the alert triggered, slowly circling closer to my building. That meant he'd been deliberately testing how close he could get, seeing if he could find a way around the restrictions. The judge revoked Blake's bail at the hearing the next day and ordered him held in jail until trial. Detective Tanaka called to tell me the news and said I could breathe a little easier now, knowing Blake couldn't physically get to me. But she also warned that Blake might try to contact me through other people or through mail from jail, and I should report any contact immediately no matter how indirect it seemed. I finally made an appointment with a therapist who specialized in trauma from intimate partner violence and stalking. My regular doctor had given me the referral weeks ago, but I'd been too busy dealing with police reports and court proceedings to actually call. Sitting in the therapist's office for the first time, I broke down crying before I even finished explaining what happened. The therapist, whose name was Dr. Diaz, handed me tissues and waited patiently while I pulled myself together. She said everything I was feeling was a normal response to genuine danger and betrayal. She explained that my trouble sleeping, my constant checking of the door locks, my jumping at unexpected sounds, were all symptoms of hypervigilance that develops when someone's safety has been threatened. Dr. Diaz said these weren't signs of weakness or overreaction. They were my brain's way of trying to protect me from future harm. She helped me understand that what Blake did wasn't just a bad breakup or cheating drama. It was a form of violence that targeted my sense of safety and autonomy. Naming it as violence rather than minimizing it as relationship problems gave me permission to take my fears seriously, instead of feeling like I should just get over it. Dr. Diaz asked about my support system and seemed relieved when I told her about Isabella, Raphael, the spin class community, and even Blake's mom and sister staying in contact. She said having people who believed me and validated my experience was crucial for recovery from this kind of trauma. We talked about coping strategies for managing anxiety and panic attacks when they hit. She taught me grounding techniques to use when I felt overwhelmed, like focusing on 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. She explained that healing from trauma isn't linear, and I'd have good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. The goal wasn't to never feel afraid again, but to develop tools for managing the fear so it didn't control my life. Doctor. Diaz scheduled me for weekly appointments and said we'd work on processing the betrayal alongside the fear, because both were important parts of what I needed to heal from. Cassie texted me a few days later asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We'd exchanged numbers at the police station meeting but hadn't talked much since then. I agreed, and we met at a cafe halfway between our apartments. Cassie looked tired but determined when she sat down across from me. She said she'd been thinking a lot about Blake and trying to understand how she missed the signs of who he really was. At work, Blake had been so charming and professional that everyone liked him. He was good at his job, or at least good at appearing to be good at his job. Other employees would defend him when Cassie first raised concerns about his falsified reports. She said it reminded her of how Blake's girlfriends didn't believe each other about his cheating because he'd been so convincing in his lies about each of us. Cassie described the moment when she confronted Blake privately about the irregularities in his client reports, giving him a chance to explain before taking it higher. His entire demeanor changed in that moment. The charm disappeared, and she saw cold anger underneath. He told her she was wrong, that she was targeting him, that she'd regret making accusations she couldn't prove. But Cassie had documented everything before confronting him. When she showed him the evidence, he got quiet in a way that was scarier than yelling. He just looked at her with this flat expression and said, "Okay." She fired him that day with HR present, following all proper procedures. And then the stalking started. Photos of her outside her apartment. Messages from fake accounts. Him showing up at her gym, her grocery store, places she went regularly. She'd gone to the police, but they said without direct threats they couldn't do much. Now with Blake's arrest and the evidence on his phone, she finally felt like someone was taking her seriously. Cassie said she understood now that Blake's rage wasn't really about the job, or even about me and the other girlfriends. It was about control. When we held him accountable for his actions, we took away his control, and that's what he couldn't handle. Every woman who tried to set boundaries with Blake faced his escalating anger because we were challenging his belief that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. I understood that we needed to talk about what Blake had done, but the coffee shop conversation felt heavy in a different way than I expected. She wasn't just sharing information anymore. She was trying to help me understand something bigger about who Blake was and why he acted the way he did. Her words about control stayed with me after we left, replaying in my head during the drive home. I kept thinking about all the times Blake had subtly steered decisions in our relationship, making me feel like I was choosing things when really he was always directing the outcome. The therapy appointment Dr. Diaz had scheduled couldn't come fast enough. 2 weeks after Blake's arrest, Mrs. Leek sent a text to all of us. She wanted to host dinner at her house. She said she needed to apologize in person and hear our stories properly, not through police reports or secondhand information. The text felt genuine but also terrifying. Walking into Blake's childhood home, sitting at his family's dinner table, facing his mother while talking about what he did to us. Isabella texted me immediately after we both got the message asking if I was going. I didn't know. Part of me wanted to avoid anything connected to Blake and his family, even though Mrs. Leek had been nothing but supportive. But another part of me felt like maybe this dinner could help. Like hearing his mom acknowledge what he did might provide some closure I didn't even know I needed. Isabella decided to go. Then Cassie confirmed she was attending. Adriana, the third woman who'd come forward after the viral video, said yes too. By the time Saturday arrived, 7 of us were driving to Mrs. Leek's house in different cars, all nervous about what this dinner would be like. I arrived first, parking in front of a neat suburban house with flower boxes in the windows. Mrs. Leek opened the door before I could knock, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than I expected. Her eyes were already red when she let me go. The others arrived within minutes, and soon we were all standing in her living room, looking at family photos on the walls that included Blake at various ages. She'd set the dining table with nice dishes and made enough food for twice as many people. We sat down together, 7 women who'd all been deceived by the same man, facing his mother who'd chosen to believe us over him. Mrs. Leek didn't eat much. She spent most of the evening listening as each of us shared our stories. How long we'd dated Blake, what lies he told us, how we discovered the truth, the specific ways he'd manipulated and controlled us. She cried openly through all of it, never once making excuses or trying to defend him. When Cassie described the stalking photos Blake took of her outside her apartment, Mrs. Leek's hands shook so badly she had to put down her water glass. After Adriana explained how Blake had isolated her from her friends by convincing her they were jealous of their relationship, Mrs. Leek covered her face and sobbed. But she never asked us to stop. She never suggested we were exaggerating or misunderstanding. She just listened and absorbed the full scope of what her son had done to all of us. When everyone had finished sharing, Mrs. Leek spoke quietly about the therapy she'd started attending. She said she kept trying to understand how she missed the signs, whether she'd enabled his behavior somehow, if there were warning signs in his childhood that she'd ignored or dismissed. Her therapist was helping her work through the guilt, but she said she didn't think she'd ever fully forgive herself for not seeing who Blake really was. Then she looked at each of us directly and said she was committed to testifying for the prosecution if it would help protect other women from him. She said she loved her son, But she loved the truth more, and the truth was that Blake had hurt people and needed to face real consequences. Her voice broke when she said it, but she didn't take the words back. The dinner ended with all of us crying together. This strange group of women connected by one man's cruelty and his mother's unexpected integrity. The district attorney's office called me 3 days later with news about a plea deal. They'd offered Blake a package that included jail time, mandatory psychological treatment, and extended probation with GPS monitoring after release. The prosecutor explained that plea deals were common in cases like this, that they saved the victims from having to testify and guaranteed some punishment, even if it wasn't as severe as what a trial conviction might bring. She said they'd offered Blake 2 years in jail, followed by 8 years of supervised probation, plus required therapy and restraining orders for all of us. It seemed reasonable to me. Not enough, but something. Detective Tanaka called me later that same day with different news. Blake had refused the plea deal. His lawyer had apparently spent an hour trying to convince him to take it, explaining that the evidence against him was overwhelming and a trial would likely result in a harsher sentence. But Blake insisted he was the victim of a conspiracy by vindictive women who were embarrassed about being exposed in the viral video. He told his lawyer that he wouldn't plead guilty to crimes he didn't commit, that we were all lying, that he'd done nothing wrong except love the wrong people. Detective Tanaka's frustration came through clearly over the phone. She said Blake's refusal to accept any responsibility, even in the face of documented evidence and multiple witness statements, showed exactly the kind of personality disorder the court psychologist had noted in his evaluation. She explained that his need to maintain his narrative of innocence was apparently stronger than his self-preservation instinct, which made him more dangerous, but also meant we had a chance at a trial conviction with serious consequences. She warned me that going to trial would be harder on all of us, that we'd have to testify and face cross-examination from Blake's defense attorney, that the whole process would take months instead of weeks. But she also said that if we won at trial, Blake would face significantly more jail time than the plea deal offered. The prosecutor was confident about the case given the evidence, but trials were always unpredictable. I had to decide whether I was willing to go through the trauma of testifying in order to potentially get Blake a longer sentence. I spent days going back and forth on whether to attend the trial in person or let my recorded testimony be used instead. The prosecutor had said both options were available, that they'd videotaped my statement and could present it to the jury if being in the courtroom with Blake was too traumatic. Part of me wanted to avoid seeing him again, avoid the anxiety of sitting in a witness box while his lawyer tried to make me look like a liar or someone seeking revenge. But another part of me kept thinking about what Cassie had said at coffee, about how Blake's rage came from losing control when women held him accountable. If I let him avoid facing me in court, wasn't that giving him some of that control back? So did Isabella called me while I was still wrestling with the decision. She said she'd decided to testify in person. Her voice was steady when she explained why. She said Blake had made her feel invisible while he was using her, telling her she was special while treating her like one interchangeable part of his system. She wanted him to see her now, to look at her face while she told the truth about what he did. She wanted the jury to see both of them in the same room so they could judge for themselves who was telling the truth. Her courage made my decision easier. I called the prosecutor back and said I'd testify in person too, even though I was terrified. She scheduled prep sessions to help me prepare for cross-examination and warned me that Blake's defense attorney would try every tactic to discredit my testimony. But she also said that victims who testified in person often had more impact on juries than recorded statements, that there was power in looking someone in the eye while telling your truth. I marked the trial date on my calendar and tried not to think about sitting in the same room as Blake while he stared at me from the defense table. The preliminary hearing happened first, a smaller proceeding where the judge would determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. Raphael testified about the nights he'd observed Blake surveilling my apartment building. He took the stand wearing a button-down shirt and spoke in the same calm, factual tone he'd used when giving his statement to police. He described 3 consecutive nights when he'd noticed Blake's car parked across the street, always late evening into early morning hours. He pulled up the photos he'd taken of the license plate on his phone, explaining that something felt off about a guy just sitting there, watching the building for hours. The prosecutor asked him to walk through each night in detail: what time he first noticed the car, how long it stayed, whether he'd seen Blake get out or approach the building. Raphael's answers were precise and credible, backed up by timestamps on his photos and his consistent observations across multiple nights. Blake's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination looking confident, like he thought he could poke holes in Raphael's testimony easily. He started by asking about Raphael's relationship with me, suggesting that maybe Raphael was romantically interested and therefore biased in his observations. Raphael's expression didn't change. He stated calmly that he was happily married, that his wife could confirm he'd discussed the suspicious car with her before even knowing which apartment the guy might be watching. The defense attorney tried a different angle, asking if Raphael could be absolutely certain the person in the car was Blake, since he'd been observing from a distance at night. Raphael nodded and explained that he'd seen Blake clearly under the streetlight when he got out of his car on the 3rd night, that he'd even considered approaching him to ask what he was doing before deciding to call the building security instead. The attorney asked a few more questions but couldn't shake Raphael's calm, detailed responses. His credibility as a neutral witness, someone with no stake in the outcome except concern about suspicious activity in his building, strengthened the stalking charges significantly. The prosecutor looked satisfied when Raphael stepped down. Adriana's testimony came during the same preliminary hearing, revealing details that added another dimension to the prosecution's case. She took the stand looking nervous but determined, explaining how she'd dated Blake for 8 months before discovering his other relationships through the viral video. The prosecutor asked her about what happened after she confronted Blake and broke things off. Adriana described blocking him on all social media platforms and her phone, thinking that would end any contact between them. But within days, she started getting friend requests and messages from accounts she didn't recognize. The profiles looked real enough, photos and posts that seemed like actual people, but the messages were always asking about her, wanting to know how she was doing, if she was seeing anyone new. Something about the tone felt familiar. She ignored most of them until one account sent her a message that referenced a private joke only Blake would know. That's when she realized he was creating fake profiles to monitor her after she'd blocked him. The prosecutor introduced evidence from the technical team who'd traced these fake accounts back to Blake's devices. They'd found multiple profiles created from his laptop and phone, all designed to look like random people but actually controlled by Blake to keep tabs on Adriana and several other women. The digital forensics expert explained the level of planning involved, how Blake had set up separate email addresses for each fake profile, used different photos downloaded from obscure websites, even created fake friend networks to make the profiles look legitimate. This wasn't impulsive behavior or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was systematic digital stalking that showed Blake's obsessive need to maintain surveillance over women who tried to leave him. The prosecutor emphasized this point during her questioning, asking Adriana how it felt to discover Blake was still watching her, even after she'd taken every normal step to cut off contact. Adriana's voice shook when she answered that it made her feel like she could never truly escape him, like he'd always find a way to invade her privacy no matter what boundaries she tried to set. The prosecutor told me after the hearing that this kind of detailed evidence of planning and persistence made it much harder for Blake to claim his behavior was impulsive or misunderstood. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The fake social media profiles proved premeditation and ongoing stalking behavior that went beyond just showing up places or sending messages. It demonstrated the calculated nature of Blake's surveillance system and his refusal to respect any boundaries the women in his life tried to establish. The court-appointed psychologist delivered her evaluation 3 weeks later. She diagnosed Blake with narcissistic personality disorder, noting his complete lack of empathy for any of us. The report described him as someone who viewed other people as objects to be controlled, rather than individuals with their own lives. But the evaluation also concluded Blake was fully competent to stand trial and understood the wrongfulness of his actions. His defense team had been hoping for a mental illness diagnosis they could use as mitigation, but the psychologist made it clear Blake knew exactly what he was doing when he stalked us, when he threatened us, when he tried to break into my apartment. He wasn't sick. He was dangerous. The prosecutor told me this distinction mattered because it meant Blake couldn't claim he didn't understand his behavior was wrong or that he couldn't control himself. The evaluation proved he made deliberate choices to hurt people who tried to hold him accountable. I went to the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, needing basic supplies and trying to maintain some normal routine. I was standing in the cereal aisle comparing prices when I saw him. Same height as Blake, same dark hair, same build. My vision tunneled. My heart started racing so fast I thought it would explode. I couldn't breathe. My hands went numb. The boxes of cereal blurred together. I dropped my basket and grabbed the shelf to keep from falling. A store employee appeared next to me, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. She guided me to a quiet office in the back and stayed with me while I shook and gasped for air. She didn't ask questions, just brought me water and tissues. I called Isabella with trembling fingers. She arrived 20 minutes later and drove me home. I felt so embarrassed about my reaction until my therapist reminded me that trauma responses aren't logical or controllable. Seeing someone who looked like Blake triggered my body's survival system even though my brain knew it wasn't him. She helped me develop coping strategies for managing triggers while I was still in the acute phase of processing everything. We practiced grounding techniques and breathing exercises for when panic hit. The prosecutor's office scheduled multiple practice sessions to prepare me for testimony. They set up a mock courtroom and walked me through the questions they'd ask and the questions Blake's defense attorney would likely ask. The lead prosecutor warned me that Blake's lawyer would try to make me seem vindictive or unstable, that staying calm and clear would be my most powerful response. She taught me to focus on factual answers rather than getting drawn into emotional reactions. Isabella and I practiced together at her apartment, taking turns playing the hostile defense attorney to prepare each other for the real experience. She asked me terrible questions about whether I was jealous, whether I was lying for attention, whether I provoked Blake. I asked her similar questions until we could both answer without our voices shaking. The practice felt brutal, but necessary. We needed to be ready for someone trying to make us look bad in front of a jury. Mrs. Leek took the stand on the trial's second day. The prosecutor asked her about finding Blake's high school journals in his childhood bedroom after his arrest. She described reading entries where teenage Blake documented manipulating multiple girls at his high school, keeping track of which lies he told to which girl so he wouldn't get caught. The journals showed this pattern started young, that Blake had been practicing these tactics for over a decade. When the prosecutor asked about confronting Blake after his arrest, Mrs. Atleek's voice broke. She testified that he showed no remorse, only anger that he'd been caught and exposed. Her testimony as his own mother choosing to support his victims over him was devastating to his defense. I watched Blake's face contort with rage as she spoke. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the table. The judge had to warn him about his courtroom behavior when he muttered audible insults toward his mother. Several jury members looked at him with disgust. His own mother was testifying against him, and he couldn't even control his reaction. I took the stand the next morning. My hands shook as I placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor walked me through our 4-year relationship, asking specific questions about when we met, how often we saw each other, when we talked about getting married. I described the discovery at spin class, seeing Isabella on Blake's phone, the shock of learning he'd been dating her for 6 months while telling her I was a crazy stalker. The prosecutor asked about Blake's escalating threats after the viral video, and I calmly presented the screenshots of his 2 a.m. messages threatening to destroy me. I showed the surveillance evidence Raphael provided of Blake's car outside my apartment for 3 consecutive nights. I described the terror of hearing him pound on my door and try to force his way inside. Blake's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He asked if I was exaggerating because I was a scorned woman. I looked directly at him and said no. I was telling the truth about being stalked by someone who couldn't accept consequences. He asked if I provoked Blake by posting about him on social media. I clarified that I never posted anything, that his sister posted the video, and that his threatening behavior started before any social media exposure. The attorney tried several more tactics to shake my testimony, but I stayed calm and factual. The prosecutor had prepared me well. Isabella testified after lunch. She walked the jury through Blake's 6-month deception, how he told her from the beginning that I was his crazy ex who stalked him. She explained believing him because he seemed so genuine, so concerned about this supposedly unstable woman who wouldn't leave him alone. The defense attorney made the mistake of suggesting she was lying for attention. Isabella pulled out her phone and showed months of text messages between her and Blake, photos of them together at restaurants and parks, receipts from dates they went on. She calmly presented her relationship timeline with specific dates and details that proved every word she said. The defense attorney tried to interrupt her, but she kept going, her voice steady and clear. She explained how discovering the truth at spin class made her realize Blake had manipulated her into believing his lies about me. Her calm, detailed responses made the attorney look foolish for questioning her credibility. I watched the jury's body language shift noticeably in our favor during her testimony. Several jurors leaned forward, paying close attention. One woman nodded along as Isabella spoke. Cassie took the stand the following day. She testified about Blake's workplace misconduct, the falsified client reports she caught him creating, the progressive discipline process her company followed before terminating his employment. The defense tried to paint her as a vindictive boss who fired Blake unfairly, but Cassie presented documented evidence of every step. She showed the written warnings, the meetings with HR, the final incident that led to his termination. Then she described what happened after. The threatening messages Blake sent saying she ruined his life over nothing. The photos he took of her outside her apartment building at night. The surveillance shots of her leaving her gym, walking to her car in the parking garage. Her professional demeanor and thorough documentation made it clear she followed proper procedures and that Blake's subsequent stalking was retaliation for legitimate accountability. The defense attorney had no effective response to her organized evidence. Cassie had kept records of everything, anticipating she might need to prove her case someday. The prosecution presented expert testimony from a stalking behavior specialist who'd reviewed all the evidence in Blake's case. The expert explained that Blake's pattern of surveillance, threats, and boundary violations represented a high-risk profile for escalating violence. She walked the jury through research on intimate partner stalkers, showing statistics about how these cases often progress from monitoring to physical assault. The expert pointed to Blake's attempted break-in at my apartment as a critical escalation point that likely would have resulted in physical violence if Raphael hadn't intervened and police hadn't arrived quickly. This testimony helped the jury understand that Blake's behavior wasn't just crazy ex-boyfriend drama, but genuinely dangerous criminal conduct. The expert described how stalkers like Blake view their victims as property they have the right to control, and how that mindset makes them extremely dangerous when victims try to establish independence. Several jury members took notes during this testimony. The expert's credentials and calm presentation of research made her testimony powerful and credible. Blake took the stand in his own defense the next day, against his attorney's obvious advice. His lawyer had tried to talk him out of it during a recess, but Blake insisted he could charm the jury the way he charmed his girlfriends. He presented himself as the real victim, claiming we were all conspiring against him because we were jealous of each other and embarrassed about being exposed in the viral video. He said he never stalked anyone. that he just wanted to talk to me and explain things. He claimed the threatening texts were taken out of context, that he was just upset and venting. His testimony was so self-centered and lacking in accountability that I watched several jury members' expressions harden as he spoke. He kept talking about how unfair everything was to him, how his life was ruined, how none of us understood his side. He never once acknowledged the harm he caused to any of us. One juror actually shook her head in disbelief while he was speaking. During cross-examination, the prosecutor methodically walked Blake through each lie he told. She asked him to explain why he told Isabella I was his crazy stalker when we were actually in a committed relationship. Blake stumbled through an answer about trying to protect Isabella from my supposed instability. The prosecutor showed the jury photos Blake posted of us together during the same period he was dating Isabella, asking how that matched his claim. Blake said he was confused about the timeline. She asked him to explain the surveillance photos of Cassie outside her apartment. Blake claimed he just happened to be in the neighborhood. She showed him timestamps proving he was there at midnight, 2 in the morning, 3 different nights. Blake's frustration grew as he realized he couldn't manipulate his way out of documented evidence. The prosecutor asked him about the threatening texts he sent me. Blake raised his voice, saying I deserved to know what she did to his life. His mask slipped as he snapped at the prosecutor with barely contained rage. The jury saw the same anger we all experienced when we tried to hold him accountable. His attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. Blake had shown the jury exactly who he was. The courtroom felt smaller on the day of closing arguments, like the walls had moved closer during the weeks of testimony. I sat between Isabella and Cassie in the gallery, our hands linked together, forming a chain of solidarity. The prosecutor stood first, her black suit sharp and professional as she faced the jury. She walked them through everything methodically, the surveillance photos Blake took of 5 different women, the threatening texts sent at 2 in the morning, the fake social media accounts he created to monitor us after we blocked him, the attempted break-in at my apartment caught on Raphael's doorbell camera. She showed them the timeline proving Blake maintained relationships with at least 5 women simultaneously, each of us believing we were exclusive with him for months or years. She displayed his high school journals documenting similar manipulation patterns starting at age 16. The prosecutor's voice stayed calm and factual as she described how Blake told each woman the others were crazy stalkers, how he used our love and trust as weapons against us. She pointed to the witness testimony from his own mother, who chose truth over protecting her son. She reminded the jury of the psychological expert's assessment that Blake viewed women as property to control rather than people with autonomy. Her closing statement painted Blake as a calculating predator whose system of deception collapsed into violence when we discovered the truth and tried to hold him accountable. The evidence covered 3 tables at the front of the courtroom, physical proof of his systematic operation. Blake's defense attorney stood next, younger than I expected. Probably assigned this case because no experienced lawyer wanted to defend the indefensible. He tried his best, though, called Blake a flawed man who made mistakes in his personal life, suggested we were vindictive women conspiring together because we felt embarrassed about the viral video. He claimed the threatening texts were taken out of context, just emotional venting from someone whose life was falling apart. He argued the surveillance photos were coincidental, that Blake just happened to be in those neighborhoods. He painted Blake as the real victim, someone persecuted by angry exes who couldn't accept that relationships sometimes end badly. The defense attorney's voice carried less conviction than the prosecutor's, like he knew he was losing even as he spoke. Several jury members looked skeptical during his arguments, their arms crossed or heads shaking slightly. He finished by asking the jury to remember that making bad romantic choices isn't the same as being a criminal. The judge dismissed us for lunch before jury deliberations began. We waited in a private room the victim advocate secured for us, unable to eat the sandwiches someone brought. Isabella paced near the window. Cassie checked her phone every 30 seconds. Adriana sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Raina talked to her brother Malik in hushed tones near the door. Mrs. Gleek arrived an hour into our wait, her eyes red from crying during closing arguments. She hugged each of us individually, apologizing again for raising a son who caused so much harm. Ellie came with her, bringing coffee and trying to lighten the mood with stories about Blake's childhood mishaps. The humor felt forced but appreciated. Detective Tanaka stopped by twice with updates that weren't really updates, just checking on our mental state while we waited. 6 hours felt like 6 days. My leg bounced constantly. Isabella wore a path in the carpet with her pacing. Every time footsteps approached the door, we all tensed, hoping for news. The bailiff finally knocked at 4:47 p.m. The jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Blake sat at the defense table in a suit his mother probably bought him, his expression blank, but his hands gripping the table edge. The jury filed in, none of them looking at Blake. I'd read somewhere that was a bad sign for defendants. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The 4 women stood, an older black woman who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial. She said they had. The clerk read the charges one by one. Stalking in the 1st degree, guilty. Harassment, guilty. Attempted burglary, guilty. Criminal violation of privacy, guilty. Multiple counts of violating restraining orders, guilty on all counts. Blake's face went completely pale, all the blood draining away until he looked gray. His eyes darted around the courtroom like he was searching for someone to save him, to tell him this wasn't really happening. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Blake shrugged it off. Mrs. Leek was crying in the row behind me, her hand covering her mouth. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks from today. Blake had to be physically guided from the courtroom by the bailiff, his legs apparently not working properly anymore. We sat frozen in our seats until he was gone. Outside the courtroom, we stood in a cluster near the elevators, not quite believing it was over. The prosecutor found us there and shook each of our hands, telling us our testimony made the difference. Mrs. Leeks approached her separately, thanking her for the verdict even though it meant her son was going to prison. She told the prosecutor she was grateful, that maybe now Blake would be forced to get the help he desperately needed. Detective Tanaka joined us. Her usual serious expression softened slightly. She said this was one of the strongest outcomes she'd seen in a stalking case, that the guilty verdicts on all counts would mean real consequences. We exchanged numbers and email addresses. This group of women who'd been brought together by Blake's manipulation, but stayed connected through mutual support. Isabella hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. Cassie wiped tears from her face with the back of her hand. Adriana and Reina held each other. Even the victim advocate looked emotional. The relief felt physical, like something heavy had been lifted off my chest. We knew 4 years in prison wasn't enough time for the harm Blake caused, but it was something. It was accountability. It was proof that we'd been heard and believed. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of the judge at Blake's sentencing hearing, my prepared statement shaking in my hands. The courtroom felt different now. The verdict already decided. This just the final step. I talked about how Blake's betrayal shattered my ability to trust, how his stalking made me afraid in my own home, how I still checked door locks 3 times before bed and jumped at unexpected noises. I described the financial cost of moving apartments and installing security systems, the emotional cost of therapy and sleepless nights, the professional impact of missing work for court dates, and being too anxious to focus. My voice stayed mostly steady even though my hands trembled. Isabella went next, describing how Blake's manipulation made her doubt her own judgment and instincts, how learning she was one of many women he deceived made her feel like an object rather than a person. Cassie talked about the professional consequences of Blake's stalking, how she had to involve building security and HR at work, how she still felt unsafe in parking garages. Adriana described 8 months of believing Blake's lies about his other girlfriends being crazy, the shame of realizing she'd been manipulated so completely. Rena flew in again to describe Blake's harassment campaign 2 years ago that forced her to change jobs and cities. 5 women, 5 different stories, all describing the same man's pattern of deception and control. The weight of our combined testimony filled the courtroom. The judge listened to every word, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Blake's lawyer made a brief statement about his client's difficult childhood and mental health struggles, asking for leniency and treatment rather than incarceration. Blake himself was given the chance to speak, but declined, his lawyer probably advising him that anything he said would only make things worse. The judge took a long pause before pronouncing sentence, looking directly at Blake the entire time. 4 years in state prison followed by 10 years of supervised probation. Mandatory psychological treatment both during and after incarceration. Permanent restraining orders protecting all 5 victims with no expiration date. The judge's statement emphasized that Blake's systematic deception of multiple women combined with his stalking and attempted break-in represented a serious threat to public safety that required significant incarceration. She noted his complete lack of remorse throughout the trial and his continued attempts to manipulate even from the defense table. She said the court had a responsibility to protect potential future victims from Blake's established pattern of behavior. Blake's face showed pure shock as the sentence was read, like he genuinely believed his charm would save him even after the guilty verdicts. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The bailiff approached to take him into custody. Mrs. Leek was crying again but nodded when the judge finished, accepting that this was necessary. We gathered outside the courthouse afterward, the afternoon sun too bright after hours in the dim courtroom. The relief was overwhelming, mixed with exhaustion and residual fear that 4 years wouldn't be enough. Detective Tanaka found us on the courthouse steps and reminded us that the permanent restraining orders and extended probation meant Blake would face immediate consequences if he tried to contact any of us after release. She gave us her card again, told us to call if we ever felt unsafe or if Blake violated his probation conditions. We stood there for almost an hour, not wanting to separate, this group of women who'd supported each other through the worst experience of our lives. We took a photo together, all 7 of us plus Mrs. Leek and Ellie, documenting this moment of victory even though it felt complicated. Isabella suggested we get dinner to celebrate, but none of us felt hungry. We settled for coffee at a shop near the courthouse, sitting around a large table and talking about everything except Blake. Cassie told funny stories about her new job. Adriana showed us photos of her recent vacation. Reina talked about her graduate program. We exchanged contact information again, making plans to stay connected beyond the trial. The barista kept refilling our cups for free after overhearing parts of our conversation. When we finally left, Hugging goodbye on the sidewalk, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Safe. I started apartment hunting the next day, wanting a fresh start in a space Blake had never seen or known about. Raphael and his wife helped me look at listings, coming with me to viewings in different neighborhoods across the city. I chose a place 20 minutes from my old apartment, a second-floor unit with better security and no ground-level windows. The building had a locked entrance, cameras in the hallways, and a doorman during evening hours. Moving day came 2 weeks later. Raphael showed up with his truck at 8 in the morning. The spin class community arrived throughout the day with boxes, packing tape, and snacks. The instructor brought her girlfriend and a dolly for heavy furniture. Mrs. Leek and Ellie came with cleaning supplies and helped scrub my old apartment before I turned in the keys. Isabella coordinated everything like a general, directing traffic and keeping everyone fed. By evening, my new apartment was set up, boxes unpacked, furniture arranged. Raphael installed additional locks on the front door and windows. I ordered pizza for everyone, and we sat on my new living room floor eating and laughing. The apartment felt safe in a way my old place never had after Blake's attempted break-in. That night, alone in my new bedroom with upgraded security features and the knowledge that Blake was in prison, I slept through the night for the first time in months. 3 months after Blake's sentencing, I went on my first date since the breakup. My friend Sarah set it up with her coworker, someone who knew my whole story and was apparently patient and understanding. We met for coffee at a place near my new apartment, somewhere public and safe. I was nervous, my hands shaking slightly as I stirred sugar into my latte. He was nice, asked questions about my interests and hobbies, didn't push when I mentioned I was taking things slowly. I found myself overly alert to any signs of manipulation or dishonesty, analyzing his words for hidden meanings and red flags. My therapist had warned me this would happen, that trauma changes how we perceive potential threats. He walked me to my car afterward, respected my space when I said I wasn't ready for a hug yet. We texted a few times over the next week, but it didn't develop into anything serious. That was okay, though. The point wasn't finding a relationship. It was proving to myself that I could be open to connection again, that Blake hadn't permanently destroyed my ability to trust. Progress looked like showing up for coffee and being honest about my boundaries. Progress looked like not apologizing for taking things at my own pace. Isabella started a blog called Recognizing Red Flags 3 months after the trial ended. She was careful not to use Blake's name or any identifying details, focusing instead on the patterns of behavior that allowed him to deceive so many people at once. She wrote about love bombing and isolation tactics, about how manipulators tell each victim the others are crazy, about the warning signs she wished she'd recognized earlier. Her first post got shared hundreds of times. People commented with their own experiences, recognizing similar patterns in their past or current relationships. She created a community forum where people could share stories and advice. The blog grew into a resource with articles about healthy relationship dynamics, how to spot gaslighting, when to trust your instincts. Isabella interviewed experts and survivors, building a library of information. She sent me every post before publishing, making sure I was comfortable with any details that might reference our shared experience. Watching her turn our trauma into education and support for others felt powerful. She told me the blog helped her healing process, transforming her shame about being manipulated into purpose. 6 months in, she had thousands of regular readers and a waiting list for her online support groups. Cassie filed her civil lawsuit 2 months after Blake's sentencing. She hired a lawyer who specialized in stalking cases and built a detailed case about the emotional harm Blake caused. The depositions took weeks. Blake's lawyer tried to argue that firing him was the real harm, that Cassie had destroyed his career over a misunderstanding. But Cassie's documentation was thorough. Every threatening message, every photo he took outside her apartment, every time he showed up at her gym. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before awarding her $50,000 in damages. The judgment would garnish Blake's wages after his release from prison. Cassie called me the day the verdict came through. She sounded tired but satisfied. She told me she didn't expect to collect much money, that Blake would probably find ways to avoid paying. But the civil verdict provided additional legal documentation of his behavior. It sent a message that stalking had financial consequences beyond criminal penalties. Isabella and I talked about filing similar suits. Adriana was already consulting with lawyers. The idea of holding Blake accountable in every possible way felt right. Detective Tanaka contacted me 3 weeks after Cassie's trial ended. She asked if I would speak at a police training session about victim experiences with the criminal justice system in stalking cases. I agreed, though the idea of standing in front of a room full of officers made me nervous. The training was held at the police academy downtown. 20 officers sat in rows taking notes. I shared both the ways the system helped me and the ways it failed. Tanaka's quick response when Blake tried to break into my apartment probably saved my life. The victim advocate who walked me through every court date made the process less scary. The prosecutor's thorough preparation meant Blake couldn't manipulate his way out of consequences. But I also talked about the initial inability to act on stalking evidence before Blake violated the restraining order. How I knew I was in danger, but the legal system couldn't intervene until he actually tried to hurt me. Several officers asked questions about what would have helped earlier. I suggested better protocols for documenting patterns of behavior, more training on recognizing escalation signs, faster response times for restraining order violations. Tanaka told me afterward that my feedback would help inform new department policies. That felt meaningful, like maybe other women wouldn't have to wait until their stalker showed up at their door. I started reaching out to old friends about a month after the police training. Friends I'd let drift away during my relationship with Blake. I realized his subtle discouragement of my friendships was part of his control strategy. He never forbade me from seeing them, just made it difficult. Always had something planned when they were invited me out. Made comments about how they were bad influences or didn't really care about me. Created small conflicts that made maintaining friendships exhausting. Sarah was the first person I called. We'd been close in college but barely talked the last 2 years. She answered on the second ring and immediately said she was glad to hear from me. We met for lunch at the cafe near her office. She didn't ask why I'd been distant or make me explain, just hugged me and said she was happy I was back. My friend group welcomed me the same way. No judgment about the years I was less available. They'd seen the viral video, followed the trial, understood what I'd been dealing with. Having that support network again made me feel less defined by the trauma. I remembered who I was before Blake, the friendships and interests and life I'd built that had nothing to do with him. 6 months after Blake's sentencing, I attended my cousin's wedding in the suburbs. The reception was at a country club with a huge ballroom and terrible DJ. I was standing by the bar waiting for a drink when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and recognized James, one of Blake's college friends. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He told me he wanted to apologize for not believing the rumors about Blake's behavior sooner. I hadn't known there were rumors. James explained that Blake always seemed like such a good guy in their friend group. Charming, helpful, the person everyone liked. When the viral video first surfaced, James thought it was exaggerated or taken out of context. But then more women came forward. Then the trial. Then seeing all the evidence laid out in news coverage. James described the cognitive dissonance of learning the truth as really difficult to process. How he kept trying to reconcile the Blake he knew with the Blake who stalked multiple women. His apology helped me understand that Blake's manipulation extended beyond his romantic relationships. He'd built a whole persona with his friends, his coworkers, his family. Everyone saw the version of Blake he wanted them to see. The mask only slipped when someone tried to hold him accountable. Isabella and I took a weekend trip together 2 weeks after the wedding. Our first real vacation since everything happened. We drove up to a state park 3 hours north, rented a cabin, and spent 2 days hiking trails and sitting by the lake. The first night, we stayed up late talking about how much our lives had changed. We laughed about the absurdity of meeting during a spin class while her boyfriend FaceTimed my boyfriend. How that horrible moment led to a genuine friendship. Isabella told me she was grateful for the truth, even though learning it was devastating. I realized I felt the same way. Better to know Blake was a manipulative stalker than spend more years believing his lies. We hiked 8 miles the second day, pushing ourselves up steep trails until our legs burned. At the summit, we took photos and ate sandwiches and didn't talk about Blake at all. Just enjoyed being 2 friends on a trip together. The weekend reminded me that healing wasn't just about processing trauma. It was also about building new experiences and memories that had nothing to do with what Blake did. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning about 3 weeks after the hiking trip. I thought I was in trouble for taking so much time off during the trial. Instead, she told me I was getting a promotion. The leadership team had been impressed by my resilience and professionalism during everything with Blake. I'd maintained my work performance, met all my deadlines, never let the personal crisis affect my job responsibilities. The promotion came with a significant raise and new responsibilities managing a small team. The recognition felt validating. Blake had tried to destroy my life, but I'd kept showing up and doing good work anyway. The extra money helped me rebuild my financial stability, after the costs of moving to a new apartment and upgrading all my security systems. Professional success reminded me that Blake's actions didn't define my entire life or capabilities. I was still good at my job, still valued by my employer, still building a career that had nothing to do with him. Mrs. Leek and I started meeting for coffee every few months. The first time felt awkward. She was Blake's mother, and part of me wondered if she secretly resented me for his imprisonment. But she ordered us both lattes and immediately asked how I was really doing. We talked for 2 hours. She shared updates about Blake's required therapy in prison. The letters he sent her still lacked genuine accountability. He mostly focused on his own suffering, how unfair the system was, how everyone had turned against him. Never acknowledged the harm he caused to me, Isabella, Cassie, or any of the other women. Mrs. Leek's voice cracked when she talked about it. She said she kept hoping each letter would show some growth or understanding, but they never did. Her continued choice to prioritize truth over enabling her son inspired me. She could have made excuses for Blake, blamed his victims, insisted he was misunderstood. Instead, she held him accountable, even though it meant accepting that her son was capable of terrible things. I was grateful for her presence as a maternal figure who believed and supported me. She told me I would always be family to her, regardless of what Blake had done. The self-defense course started on a Saturday morning at a gym downtown. 8 women from spin class signed up together. The instructor was a former military police officer who now taught civilian self-defense. She emphasized that the goal wasn't to become a fighter, but to develop awareness, assertiveness, and options for dangerous situations. We learned how to recognize threats early, how to use our voices to set boundaries, how to break common holds and create space to escape. The physical training built my confidence. Learning that I had tools to protect myself if someone tried to grab me or corner me helped me feel less vulnerable. We practiced scenarios where someone approached us aggressively or tried to follow us to our cars. The instructor taught us to trust our instincts, to not worry about being polite if something felt wrong. By the end of the 8-week course, I felt more empowered in my own body, like I had some control over my safety instead of just hoping nothing bad would happen. A journalist reached out through email about 4 months after I completed the self-defense course. She was working on a story about intimate partner stalking and the criminal justice system. She wanted to interview me about my experience. I was hesitant at first. The viral video had already put my story in the public eye more than I wanted. But the journalist assured me she was focused on systemic issues rather than sensationalizing my personal story. We met at a coffee shop and talked for 3 hours. She asked thoughtful questions about when I first felt unsafe, what barriers I encountered trying to get help, how the legal system responded. I described the gap between when victims know they're in danger and when the legal system can intervene. How I had evidence of Blake's stalking, but police couldn't act until he actually violated the restraining order. The journalist took detailed notes and said she wanted to use my case to advocate for better protective measures. The article came out 6 weeks later in a major newspaper. It highlighted the systemic problems I'd experienced and included interviews with legal experts about potential reforms. Seeing my story used to push for change felt meaningful. Maybe other women would have better options because I was willing to speak up. 1 year after Blake's sentencing, I attended a vigil for victims of intimate partner violence. The local women's shelter organized it every year in the park downtown. Hundreds of people gathered as the sun set, holding candles and listening to speakers. Survivors shared their stories. Family members remembered loved ones who didn't survive their abusers. I stood in the crowd holding my candle and realized how much I'd healed while acknowledging the ongoing impact of trauma. I still had bad days. Still got anxious when I saw someone who looked like Blake. Still checked my locks multiple times before bed. But I was functioning, working, building relationships, living a life that felt like mine again. When they were invited people to light candles for specific victims, I lit mine not just for myself, but for the women who didn't survive their stalkers. I thought about how my outcome could have been different without the support system and resources I had access to. Raphael's quick action calling police, Detective Tanaka's responsiveness, the spin class community rallying around me, Mrs. Alik choosing to believe me over her son. Not everyone had those advantages. The ceremony reminded me that healing and advocacy could exist together. I could work on my own recovery while also fighting for better systems to protect other women. I signed up for the volunteer training at the Victim Advocacy Center 3 months after the trial ended. The organization helped stalking victims understand restraining orders, court processes, and safety planning. My first session involved sitting in a circle with 7 other volunteers, all of us survivors at different stages of recovery. The facilitator asked us to share why we wanted to help others. When my turn came, I explained how Detective Tanaka's quick response and the victim advocate's guidance had probably saved my life. Using that experience to help women who were currently terrified felt like turning something horrible into something useful. A woman across from me nodded and said she'd been volunteering for 5 years after her ex-husband stalked her for 18 months. Her calm strength made me believe I could reach that place too. The training covered legal terminology, crisis intervention techniques, and how to connect victims with resources without overwhelming them. I learned that many women face the same frustrating gap I experienced, where they know they're in danger but the legal system can't act until something worse happens. By the end of the 8-week training, I felt ready to take calls on the crisis hotline and accompany women to court hearings when they needed support. The letter arrived 6 months into my volunteer work. My attorney called first to warn me that Blake's lawyer had sent a formal request. Blake wanted me to agree to lift the restraining order after his release, claiming he'd completed therapy and wanted to make amends for the harm he caused. The letter included a certificate from the prison's counseling program and a statement from his therapist about his progress. My attorney read me the key phrases over the phone. Blake had written that he understood his actions were wrong and that he hoped I could find it in my heart to allow him closure through a conversation. The lawyer's tone suggested he thought this was a reasonable request from a reformed man. My attorney cut through that immediately. She explained I had zero obligation to respond, that making amends didn't require contact with victims, and that many abusers use therapy language to manipulate their way back into victims' lives. She asked if I wanted to send a formal refusal or simply ignore it. I chose silence. Responding in any way would give Blake what he wanted, which was my attention and engagement. The restraining order would remain in effect whether I replied or not. I filed the letter in my case documents and went back to my regular life, maintaining the boundary that protected both my safety and my peace of mind. Isabella called me 8 months after the trial with news that made me actually scream with joy. She was getting married. She'd met someone through a friend's birthday party, someone who knew her full story about Blake from the beginning and never made her feel damaged or suspicious because of it. They dated carefully, building trust through consistent honesty and respect for her pace. When she told me he'd proposed during a weekend hiking trip, I could hear the happiness in her voice that had been missing during all those months with Blake. She asked me to be in her wedding party, standing beside her while she married someone who actually deserved her. I said yes immediately, already tearing up. Her engagement reminded me that Blake's betrayal didn't have to define our capacity for future relationships. She'd found healthy love after manipulation and control. Watching her plan her wedding over the next several months, seeing her excitement about building a life with someone trustworthy, gave me hope that the same possibility existed for me. Her happiness became proof that recovery was real and that Blake hadn't permanently broken our ability to trust and love. The animal shelter volunteer showed me 3 dogs in the medium-sized section. I'd decided I wanted a companion and a security system combined. Something that would bark if someone approached my apartment, but also curl up beside me on the couch. The third dog, a mixed breed with tan fur and alert ears, came right to the kennel door and pressed her nose against my hand. The volunteer said she'd been surrendered by an owner who moved and couldn't keep her, that she was 2 years old and already house-trained. I took her to the meet and greet room and sat on the floor. She climbed into my lap immediately, way too big for lapdog behavior, but clearly not aware of that fact. I adopted her that afternoon and named her Scout. Training her and establishing our routines together gave my days structure and purpose. Morning walks, evening training sessions, weekend trips to the dog park. Her presence in my apartment made me feel safer in ways I hadn't expected. She barked at every footstep in the hallway, alerting me to movement outside my door. But she also forced me to maintain regular schedules, to leave my apartment even on days when anxiety made me want to hide. My therapist noted during our next session that caring for another being was helping me rebuild my sense of stability and trust. Scout depended on me, which meant I had to show up and function even when trauma made everything feel hard. 2 years after Blake's sentencing, I went on my first real date in months with someone who had actual potential. We'd met through mutual friends who knew my history and had vouched for him before introducing us. He worked in education, had never been married, and approached relationships with the kind of thoughtful intention I'd learned to value. Our first coffee date lasted 3 hours. He asked about my life, listened to my answers, and shared his own experiences without dominating the conversation. When I mentioned I'd been through something difficult a few years ago, he didn't push for details. We went on a second date, then a third. He met Scout and spent 20 minutes playing fetch with her in the park. By our 5th date, I told him the full story about Blake. He listened without interrupting, then said he appreciated me trusting him with something so personal. We built our relationship gradually through consistent honesty and respect for boundaries. He never pushed me to move faster than I was comfortable with, never made me feel like my caution was a problem. Learning what partnership looked like without manipulation or control felt like discovering a completely different kind of relationship. My ability to be vulnerable again while maintaining healthy boundaries felt like a major milestone in my healing. I was learning that not all men operated like Blake, that healthy relationships involved mutual respect and genuine care, rather than control and deception. Detective Tanaka's call came 2 years into Blake's sentence. She asked if I had time to talk about something important. Blake was up for parole after serving half his sentence, which was standard for nonviolent offenses with good behavior. The parole board would hold a hearing in 6 weeks, and she wanted to know if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement. I said yes immediately. Over the next week, I wrote a detailed letter describing the ongoing impact of Blake's stalking. I explained the hypervigilance that still made me check my locks multiple times before bed, the anxiety that surfaced whenever I saw someone who looked like him, the ways his manipulation had affected my ability to trust people. I emphasized my concerns about his release, pointing out that 4 years wasn't enough time for genuine change in someone who'd spent years perfecting a system to deceive and control multiple women. I noted that his letter requesting contact showed he still didn't understand that victims don't owe abusers closure or forgiveness. I sent the statement to the parole board and waited. 5 weeks later, Detective Tanaka called with the decision. The parole board had denied Blake's early release, requiring him to serve his full 4-year sentence. They'd cited my statement along with statements from 3 other victims and concerns about his continued attempts to contact us through his attorney. I felt relief wash through me, buying myself 2 more years of guaranteed safety before having to deal with his release. The university invitation arrived in my email 3 months after the parole denial. A professor in the sociology department was organizing a panel discussion about intimate partner violence and asked if I'd be willing to speak about recognizing manipulation in relationships. Standing in front of the lecture hall 6 weeks later, looking at students who were the same age I'd been when I met Blake, felt surreal. I shared the story of the spin class discovery, the viral video, and everything that followed, but I focused most of my talk on the red flags I'd missed during our 4 years together. The way Blake had subtly discouraged my friendships, always having reasons why he couldn't meet my friends or why my friends were somehow problematic. The way he'd made me feel special and chosen while simultaneously making me feel like I needed to earn his attention. The way he'd responded to any boundary I tried to set by making me feel unreasonable or demanding. I talked about the support systems that saved me, the spin class women who rallied around me, Blake's own family choosing truth over loyalty, the victim advocate who helped me navigate the legal system. After my talk, 7 students approached me with concerns about their own relationships. I connected each of them with campus resources, the counseling center, and the student advocacy office. Knowing my story might help someone recognize danger earlier made the vulnerability of public speaking worth it. The notification letter arrived 3.5 years after Blake's sentencing. He was released from prison in 6 months and would begin his supervised probation period. The victim advocate called the same day to help me review my safety plan. We went through everything again: the permanent restraining order that remained in effect, the GPS monitoring he'd wear during probation, the strict no-contact orders that meant any attempt to reach me would send him back to prison. She confirmed my address was protected in all court records and that Blake's probation officer had been briefed on his full case history. While the news triggered some anxiety, the racing heartbeat and sweaty palms that used to accompany any thought of Blake, I was in a much stronger place than I'd been during the trial. I had established support systems, coping strategies that actually worked, and a life that felt solid and mine. Scout sensed my stress and pressed against my leg until I sat down to pet her. My partner came over that evening and we talked through my concerns. He reminded me that I'd survived Blake's worst already, that I had legal protections and people who would help if Blake violated any terms of his release. The anxiety didn't disappear completely, but it felt manageable, rather than overwhelming. All of Blake's known victims received the same release notification within days of each other. Isabella texted our group chat suggesting we organize a call to check in with each other and coordinate our safety plans. 8 of us joined the video call, faces I'd come to know well over the years since the trial. We'd all moved forward with our lives in different ways. Isabella was married now, Cassie had been promoted twice at a new company, Adriana had moved to a different state and started her own business. But we agreed to maintain our communication network, to alert each other immediately if Blake violated his probation or restraining orders. We shared our current safety plans, updated each other on address changes or new jobs, and promised to check in monthly even if nothing concerning happened. The solidarity that had formed during the trial remained strong years later. We'd been through something terrible together, and had chosen to transform that shared trauma into lasting support. Knowing 7 other women were watching out for me, and that I was watching out for them, made Blake's approaching release feel less scary. I planned a dinner for the 4th anniversary of Blake's arrest, wanting to mark how far I'd come while honoring the difficulty of the journey. My partner helped me set up my apartment, moving furniture to fit a bigger table. Isabella arrived first, bringing wine and flowers. Then came the spin class instructor who'd stopped the music that day, Mrs. Leek who'd chosen truth over her son, Ellie who'd posted the video that started everything, Detective Tanaka who'd built the case that put Blake away, and my therapist who'd helped me process years of trauma. We gathered around my table, Scout moving between us begging for attention, and I raised my glass. I thanked each person for the specific ways they'd helped me survive and heal. We toasted to survival, to healing, to the power of community that forms when people choose to believe and support victims. Mrs. Leek cried and said watching me build this life made her proud, that she wished her son had been worthy of me but was grateful I'd found happiness anyway. I looked around the table at these women who'd shown up for me in my worst moments and realized I was no longer defined by what Blake had done to me. I was defined by how I'd responded, by the choice to seek help instead of hiding, by the decision to turn trauma into advocacy, by the relationships I'd built and maintained. Blake had tried to destroy me, but I'd survived and built something better than what existed before. I got the notification on a Tuesday morning. Blake would be released from prison in 2 weeks, starting his probation period with ankle monitoring and mandatory therapy sessions twice a week. Detective Tanaka called me personally to walk through the details, her voice calm and steady, like always. She told me his probation officer had read the entire case file, knew about all the victims, understood the pattern of escalation. The permanent restraining orders stayed in effect, meaning Blake couldn't come within 500 feet of me, my workplace, or any location I frequented regularly. If he violated any term of his probation, he'd go straight back to prison to serve the rest of his sentence. I appreciated her thoroughness, but my hands still shook while she talked. 4 years felt like both forever and no time at all. Some days I barely thought about Blake anymore, and other days I still checked my locks 3 times before bed. Detective Tanaka must have heard something in my silence because she said I'd survived his worst already, that I had legal protections now and people watching out for me. I thanked her and sat on my couch for a long time after the call ended, Scout pressing her warm body against my legs. My partner came home from work and found me still sitting there, staring at nothing. We talked through my fears, made a plan to update my security system and review my daily routines. The anxiety felt manageable rather than overwhelming, which showed me how far I'd come since that night Blake tried to break down my door. 4 years after that moment when I saw Isabella FaceTiming my boyfriend during spin class, I'm sitting in my living room with Scout asleep at my feet, sunlight coming through windows I no longer feel scared to leave uncovered. I still go to spin class every Saturday morning where the instructor greets me with a hug, and Isabella saves me the bike next to hers. We've watched each other grow through breakups and new relationships, job changes, and personal victories. The community that formed around my worst moment has become one of the most important parts of my life. I have occasional nightmares where Blake is pounding on my door again, and sometimes I get anxious in parking garages or when I see a car that looks like his old one. But these moments don't control me anymore. I've learned to sit with the fear, acknowledge it, and then keep moving forward. My partner knows my triggers and respects them without making me feel broken. I have a job I love, friends who show up when I need them, and a sense of safety I had to fight hard to rebuild. Mrs. Leek still comments on my social media posts, still tells me I should have been her daughter-in-law, still chooses truth over enabling her son. Isabella and I text almost every day. Our friendship forged in trauma, but sustained by genuine love and respect. I'm not the same person I was before discovering Blake's betrayal. I'm stronger now, more careful about red flags, better at trusting my instincts. Blake's manipulation couldn't permanently destroy what I've built. The spin class community, Isabella's friendship, Mrs. Leek's fierce loyalty, Detective Tanaka's dedication, all these people proved that solidarity and accountability can win against manipulation and control. I survived, and I'm living proof that you can heal from betrayal and build something better than what existed before. That's how it went for me. But I know some of you would have handled it totally differently. Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading through them later.